Hello everyone, today we talk about early medieval penitentials and give a broad look at the attitude towards Christian culture in those centuries, towards the essentially bloodshed and killing, and what the general prescriptions in the position of the church was towards such actions. And this is really a huge topic because it practically encompasses the idea of just war, not just the mere killing, but the penitentials usually focus on this in the sense that the early medieval world didn't really see, at least so very rarely, huge-scale warfare. The political entities kind of shrunk in power, in reach in terms of strategical capabilities. So warfare was something that really happened often among communities that kind of knew each other, that had a certain social relation, not just merely political and military one. And they would be still also very violent societies in their own ways, not because probably they were particularly more violent than in other ages, but because there would be a very weak central authority, and therefore justice was carried out sometimes privately. Think about the Germanic juridical institution of the FIDA, that is essentially the idea that if I kill you, I'm gonna kill you or someone of your clan, until in this sense the unbalancement is not over. It's not, and you can imagine, however, what kind of practical mess this actually brought to, because we know as a matter of fact that when early medieval kingdoms started to structure and to expand in some measure, one of the at least in some regions, usually the ones who had a greater Roman legacy, especially in southern Europe, really so began to see these practices as something that had to be taken away in some measure. Then even things like the judicial duel is something that essentially remained for millennia in Europe, and that was something that you could find even up to a relatively short time ago. So there were certain practices in everyday life in society that would bring to eye for eye, or tooth for tooth, stuff like that, because societies really lived in that kind of system in order to solve the matters. So what you read in the penitentials being essentially certain manuals, at least originally speaking, it would be very very handy texts, in fact, manuals that were meant to provide a sort of guidance, for usually for the confessors, because this was the real problem here, that the faithful had to confess his sins and to repent, to feel contrited and to repent, etc. It was initially and they began to exist very early. In the late antique world, since the 4th century, I believe, at least, there was already a greater systematization of thoughts that would be, however, quite fluid in many ways, because it all started obviously from reading the Holy Scriptures, but at the same time trying to add something more to it, because the Holy Scriptures are not really a code of law. They are essentially something very different, that is also susceptible of great interpretation. Think about biblical exegesis and all the theological debates that existed then. But these were problems that really concerned the Christians, in that the local bishop that was, especially in late antiquity, when Christianity was largely still into cities and not into the country, was the urban, the Christian urban and social main point of reference in this sense. Eventually, towards the lower Middle Ages, especially, now we're talking about the early Middle Ages, and even at this time, there would be a progressive form of decentralization, even in ecclesiastical structures, for which these penitentials really passed to local priests, and they were kind of applied in a general sense also through the progressive Christianization of settled entities to really the whole society, and we can study them historically because in fact were written down. We can see how they were conceived. They were just a list of prescriptions essentially, and what I would like to talk about today is really the discrepancy that I believe that existed very much between these prescriptions and the general use. First of all, one thing I want to point out is, in absolute terms, in Christian, for the Christian beliefs, killing is a sin. So even though the Bible contemplates the idea that the evil man can be rightfully killed, the sheer idea of killing another human being is sin. It is something that is conceived as I can't say justifiable, but it can be motivated in the sense that the original sin permeates human nature, so it's not something, and it's inherent to it, so it can't, the idea of killing can't be eradicated. And this is particularly important because we will see how eventually certain killing was justified exactly on this basis, that weren't really saying the killing was right, but they were essentially making sort of relativist statement towards the same nature of earthly society in opposition to the kingdom of heaven, into which war does not exist. And I would like to stress especially that you can't really escape from this interpretation. So all the various developments of this concept are extremely interesting historically speaking, because they can show you how the relative societies that you take into consideration by Y1 into these Christian early Middle Ages applied the same concepts according to their own not just Christian ethics, but also and most often I'd say on completely different bases. And a great distinction can be done here between East and West. Usually, at least, this is done. In which measure? Well, in the idea that the Eastern Christianity, we can simply say the Byzantine Empire at this point, which is the Roman Empire. I call it Byzantine not to make just from a didactic and temporal scansion point of view. So I have no contemporary aim at defining it this way. Excuse me, I drink a little. And one characteristics of Byzantine culture, from this point of view, was the idea of sticking to the old fashion, not just to be doctrinally straight, so orthodox and Catholic at this time, which weren't at all two opposite meanings. Telling the truth, during the early Middle Ages, especially before the 11th century, the Byzantine East was far more heterodox than Western Europe. This is interesting because the Byzantines had to deal with a lot of heresies and problems, especially in the most productive lands of their empire. So at a time they would kind of be flexible towards doctrinally towards these heresies, while the West was kind of from Rome was already more, and in fact they usually said, but what the hell are you doing there in Constantinople? In this sense, even all the Western populations that inhabited Christian Europe at in the West, and that were usually fresh from Christianization, they kind of followed Rome and didn't went astray. So this is also interesting. But the Byzantines, and aside from this idea of sort of permanent sanction that had to permeate to the whole state and reflect divine perfection, etc., and therefore this strictly doctrinal orthodoxy, they would be quite traditionalist also towards the great fathers of the church, and this would happen exactly also for war, the ethics, the so-called ethics of war, in many ways. And there's a great figure in this picture that is Basil of Caesarea, Saint Basil, or Basil the Great, who had been he had lived in 4th century, and so in the golden age of the Christian East. In many ways, he was an extraordinary figure, and he left a great impact on Eastern Christianity. In many ways, I think about Basilian monasticism that was partly exported also in the West, in Southern Europe, and so he was seen as a source of knowledge, who had discipline, among the other things, the matter of, can a Christian actually shed blood? Because you have to think that spilling blood wasn't really just strictly an ideal thing from a theological point of view. The idea that blood is something impure is something strongly present since ever, because you find it in the Bible since the and in many other cultures, like even in Islam, etc. Because obviously blood implies something that, if spilled, is organic material that gets that decomposes and eventually it can be quite unhealthy. So the same idea of baths of blood, like after battles, and so we're seeing even in the general dramatic picture of the whole thing in the ancient era as something that created a negative result. Think of all the corpses rotting after a battle, the idea that the corpse is something impure. I mean, anthropology is all about this. It's the idea that the living people and dead people have to be separated, because there is this practical, very practical and objective reality that corpses decompose and they have to stay away from communities because they can make illnesses spread and other people dying. So this idea, this aversion towards blood, is not something just about killing your own enemy, because humans have already always been very cruel, the one with the other, and the same religion. I think about the Bible, all the massacres that the Jews are able to perform thanks to God and in His name. That is something that obviously had left an impact, and even in Christianity, many Christians think about the Carolingians, for example, or many other kings and heads of mighty military systems actually had a biblical model of conquest, of fight, of even of harshness. You have to think, especially in the Carolingian world, this was quite evident. The Carolingians thought of themselves to be the second Jews, essentially, and even in the way they carried out massacres in Saxony against the heathens, the Saxon, the Germanic the pagan populations that lived there, there was a very strong Old Testamentary model there that wanted to be implied as, the might of a god that is a god of the military in part. And you don't have to see that as very strange, because actually the Carolingians still felt pretty much their Germanic identity, and they would gladly take from the Bible, the examples of great Jewish kings that owed their victories and political models of rule over the defeated peoples in a very violent fashion that matched with the ancient Germanic edicts, warlike edicts. And Saint Basil, I don't even remember while we came to talk with about the Carolingians from Saint Basil, but what is important is that he made up, especially in the East, this very firm model that had talked and holy model that had talked about the eventuality of Christians being able to shed blood. First of all, there is one tract that is distinctive of early Christianity that eventually in the Byzantine East was sclerotized as an authoritative model that could not be altered in practice. That is the extreme pragmatism of the early Christian communities, because these were people that were extremely cultured and educated, but as chiefs of the church, they also had quite strong pragmatic political problems to solve, like administrating the Christian community, interacting with the political authorities, and especially backing their religious culture with parallel political concept. I mean, the ancient world had been very productive in intellectual terms. Now the Christians had to fit into that by evolving their thought and formulating new ideas that now they had with the tolerance that had been given from the Roman state to really spread in the same state and making it a Christian one. So the Roman Empire at that time, and especially when it became Christian, probably waged even more wars than what it did in previous times. Just for saying that the idea that the Christian edicts kind of weakened the Roman prowess in war is absolute wrong. I mean, there's no historical evidence of any kind that can tell this. It is true that there would be Christians who refuse to take arms because they say it's sinful to kill my kindred. So I mean my fellow man. So there are all think about geography. These great saints that were incidentally many great military saints that had become such because they had refused to serve in the army, but at the same time popular culture adopted them instead as the very opposite symbol. Christian societies liked warrior saints because they liked the fact that they killed their enemies, and this is here the jarring difference between theory, I mean Christianism saying you don't have to kill, and practice, that is Christian communities saying kill is practically justifiable. I mean, not justifiable at all theoretically from a Christian point of view, but practically you can't do that. And Basil had come out. Basil came from, we said, some eastern regions of the Byzantine Empire at that time that were actually the Roman Empire. that were border areas in the east, and there would be a lot of warfare going on, both on a small and large scale. So he was fully involved in this sense to give an answer to how do we practically respond to this, because here we have Christians that are being killed in our communities because there are brigands and enemies, etc. So is it right in Christian terms to not do anything about it, even if it implies to kill? So basic, Basil basically had, first of all, one general attitude that I was trying to say before, that is the idea of pragmatism. I mean, when something cannot be easily understood from the Bible, and there is an authoritative figure that make biblical exegesis, you don't. Basil said you don't have to take him too dogmatically. I mean, there is a man cannot give an answer, a fixed answer for a certain thing that works in every case. You have to judge case by case, and this is also very important in Christian terms, because it's never that you say, haha, I've got the Bible point, everything that's written there is fine. No, not at all. What is written in the Bible is meant to inspire you in a way that can make you aware of your choice, and however you are left alone when it takes to make that choice. You know, it's on you making the right or the wrong thing. So at every time you should be wondering that, and all the crucial aspects of this, it's really an inner one in Christianity. It's about the individual choice, not about what someone has told you to do, because that's something you feel as a Christian inspired by God. If you're able to listen to him, that's the idea. So Basil was answering in a way that said, it really depends on the situation, which is obviously a very intelligent answer. And even if killing was a canonically prohibited act, there would be certain kind of conflicts into Christians could engage, to which Christians could engage. We can't say rightfully, but that it would be necessary at a point to do, and probably seen to abstain to do it, if you could. In this we should mention also a lot of other things, honestly, about especially about the relation between the Christians and the let's say the political authorities, because it was something that the Christianity inherited straight from Judaism. The idea that, at least in theory, you had always to be obedient to political authorities, even if they're not really Christian. Which is strange, and this is not really said correctly, in the sense that obviously you have to rebel to someone who is doing something wrong, essentially, from a Christian point of view. But the Bible basically says that even if that the political authorities are sort of God's servants. So even if they sin, in a way, they're placed there by God. So you have to be mindful of them in any case. There is a beautiful passage from Romans 13:4 that says, relatively to the political ruler, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. So there is this kind of Freudian relation between Christian communities and the state, whichever it was, and the state always waged a lot of war, so the problem was evidently there. The problem here was that Christians would have, in order to become Romans and Christian Romans, to wage war as Romans as well. So they would, as I was saying, this is just on a theoretical base, in the sense that these were written things that were conceived to give practical answers in spite of the in spite of reality. The reality is that Christians joined the army in every time of history, and they mostly didn't care much about killing someone in practice, as long as the general ethics of the world at that point was focused on killing. I mean, and they didn't kill because they were Christians, but they killed because they were humans. And it's very stupid to think that war is inhuman, because if there is one thing that is truly human, cent for cent, is exactly war. So if there is really nothing unhuman or dishuman, I don't know how to say that, in war as such. So how could Basil basically justify this? Well, the whole thing was actually quite simple. Theoretically, the Christian should not become a soldier, or at least must not. And this was the ancient idea, from which also the martyrs, the military saints, actually died of, because it would be, you know, they would be court-martialed, in fact. However, there is a case that is, if there is a chief, so someone that is placed there as a political and military leader by God, and he obliges you to join arms, so that is quite meaningful, because it's basically saying, you know, if you're a Christian, theoretically you shouldn't even obey the chief, you should obey to God, and even you know, be martyrized for that. But Basil here was implying that a Christian, first of all, a chief could even overstep this and take Christians no matter what to fight. But this implies unavoidably that the Christian perspective in this sense can exist. I mean, these Christians still had a conscience, still probably didn't want to kill, in theory. Also because they concretely feared to lose salvation if they had sinned in that fashion, but they would still join the army. However, there is also the even when you join the army, you can theoretically, you shouldn't, as a Christian, theoretically sin with blood. But if you shed blood, so if you have shed blood, you have essentially to be punished in some fashion. So either was there would be a before taking the Eucharist. So you can't attend a mass if you have sinned, unless you haven't been purified by a punishment. It can be you know, abstaining from food, and or maybe tearing or wailing, and there is really not one easy way out from this, because in all fashions, you know, in Christian perspective, you have to be fully repented before accessing the Eucharist, in this sense. So you can't just pretend to do that, to do like a certain penalty and to do a certain penitence, sorry, and then just exteriorly. No, you have to really feel contrition and repentment in your soul. But at that point, it's still if you're really redeemed, you can access the community of the faithful as well. Basil said you could even go to church, even if you had not been purified, but stay substantially in another place, distant from the other faithful. Because here it was really implied that blood physically was impure, so even the actual physical distance was important in this sense, not to contaminate the other Christians. So what was, however, there was another important part into this, why you had shed blood. Whose blood you had shed, because that's really important. And Basil said that you had to kill only if to defend the weak, to defend the Christian community from the ravages of martyrs, especially if they were pagan, and if they were enemies of the church in absolute terms. So in practice, here Basil is saying that there is a kind of minimal bloodshed that can be accepted in Christian terms, that has nothing to do with the exaltation of killing, but it's basically implying that in this world that is not perfect, you can't avoid these things to happen. So if you're doing that for protecting a community of Christians, that is definitely a positive, let's say, a necessary evil in some fashion, and someone also has to carry that out. And in practical terms, there would be lots of Christians who would carry that out in the army, in every form, to fight against enemies, against brigands, etc. So this idea, however, implied that it would have to be a sort of let's say, a standard penitence that Basil identified in a long time of penitence. That was 3 years, a very long one. That is interesting in this sense because it kind of quantifies the actual value that is given to killing as a sin. And this idea of kind of weighing, even quantitatively, the amount of sin is not something that was invented back then, because already in the Old Testament, from the Old Testament, you find things like, that sin can be doubled if there is a certain condition. I mean, the Christians were kind of balancing really the evil and trying to give it a dimension also in material quantifiable terms, obviously without absolute making an absolute out of it, but still giving a sort of orientation. So the only legitimate reason of killing is the defense of the weak and of the innocent, and anyway whoever is gonna spill someone's blood has to live a lifestyle of penance for a certain time, and to be penitent, and then to be to rejoin the Christian community only after that. And this was really taken literally by the Byzantines, that from an ideal point of view said, you see, Basil said this, and this is basically what we have to follow, everyone. The West had known different perspectives, because St. Augustine, for instance, had said that if there are certain conditions for which the war is right, the political leader and political and military leader is fighting for a good cause, etc., you could actually join the army, and killing in that sense wasn't good as such, but it was accepted essentially without need of making penitence, even though it really depended on whom and how you killed. so that you couldn't go to war in a just war and just raping and slaughtering whoever you like because you weren't doing it the right way. Not at all, but it's still a very radical different approach from Basil of Caesarea. And by the way, just to say that St. Augustine was quite borderline in many ways, very radical, and that especially not even the Latin Church in the West fully absorbed what he said in this sense. As a matter of fact, the Western Church actually inherited the Basilian ideas more than the Augustinian ones, even though there is still a certain influence. So even in the West, killing was considered a sin no matter what, but with some adaptation, but more of that later. For now, relatively to the Byzantines, I would like to say that as far as we know, and there is a study, I don't remember which I don't remember the name, but one day I might make really a comment on that because it's very interesting. It basically showed that even in the most Christian Eastern Roman Empire, actually the military edicts among the military remained extremely untouched, substantially untouched by the Christian edicts. Basically, up to the 7th century, the edicts of the average Byzantine soldier was essentially the same of pagan Rome in any way. I mean, there was seemingly no aside from the general symbolism of warrior saints and the idea that the soldiers were fighting under the insignia with the cross and the Christogram, anything that really seemed to affect them, morally speaking, towards a more pacific or humanist scrupple. On the contrary, these guys kept, maintaining the ancient totemic ideals of, embodying a lion into fight, making death counts of many enemies were slaughtered, and leaving out of the pure old glory that was tributed to the soldier. And we can say that the penitentials actually were born probably in such contexts in which the church was spreading even faster than even far beyond the state boundaries into societies that would be quite warlike in early medieval times, and that really praised military deeds, and the community would be proud of their own veterans, people that came back from war, having killed, having won, etc. So the Christians instead, at least the bishops, the main religious, the main figures in the ecclesiastical hierarchy would say, look, you shouldn't be doing this. You're sinning here, and you should be do penitence in some form. And this would be a steadily marked contrast, also because it wasn't really just about war at this point. There would be communities that were still largely pagan, that were just Christian by name, but in practice maintaining the same unaltered lifestyle that they had before Christianization. So the effort of the ecclesiastical communities to carry out a reform of the customs, etc., sometimes was first of all a failure, and in general the Christianization of Europe took on these bases a very long time, as a matter of fact millennia, in order to a millennium to basically at least give the idea that certain morals were, certain things were morally right or wrong, and so on. And I thought it is quite interesting, quite striking, the contrast between the Byzantine ideals and the practice of war, because it really shows that even in the most Christian country of Europe at that time, such ideas of humanistic ideals even towards the life of the enemies would be seen still largely ignored. However, indeed, in all Byzantine history, you would find that certain penitences were carried out because the idea that killing is wrong and it can't be, and it's not something you can escape from, and from a community point of view, it has to be stigmatized. Was always there, and the Byzantines were quite inflexible on this. Now, I think instead the most fascinating development of this is in Western Europe, because in Western Europe here we have the penitentials. We have also more diversified political background, because you have you don't have a single empire like in the East, and plus there are several different cultures that are living essentially together. Think about the ethics of the Germans, how they were different from the one of the Romans, and other influences like the one of the Celts, or maybe the Eastern Iranian populations that had been around during the migration era, etc. So worlds that were quite mixed, and that paradoxically had to find even more in practice a common way of doing, because if everybody did in a different way, it would have been pretty messy indeed. So and the Western regions, even though they had been Roman for a longer time, probably were the ones who got Christianized later. I mean, Christianism mostly spread into the Mediterranean, or in those communities that were tied to the Mediterranean, so such as southern Gaul, for instance, and that kind of had sort of social and cultural characteristics that would be felt as more receptive of not just only of Christian teachings, but also of teachings in general, as from written works, etc. So of very complex doctrinal systems, etc. But most of Europe would be, of Western Europe would be still largely pagan, and quite actually affection, we can say, to the old warlike ethics that was there even previously, even in Roman culture in many ways. I mean, the idea of the being a military man in Rome was something to take a great pride from. Also, the Italics had their own warrior ethics. The same Roman army had actually pretty much struggled over the centuries to impose a certain discipline over this human material. So the idea of war, especially with the Germanic invasions, was something that was positively positively backed, especially by the Germanic elites that began to rule into Europe, and there was probably a certain convergence between these different influences. And from this point of view, it would be evident also that with as we were saying at the beginning, at the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, there would be a lot of warfare going on a local base. So a lot of people really carrying out warfare on a small scale, and really creating problems to communities and posing problems to the Christians that were trying to make civilization in this sense by creating a civil concordia, etc. Because indeed the Christians were quite concerned about the idea of creating a peaceful society, a society that is not peaceful just because you know, it's nice to do so, but because objectively, if you don't have a pacified society, it's impossible to live well. It's impossible to progress. It's impossible to expand, and it's impossible also to defend oneself, to defend the same people who live in it, and not just from the external enemies, but also from the internal one. There is all a literature in this sense that really shows the contrast of the Romanized Christianized Roman elite of bishops, etc. Especially in Gaul, there is a great production in this sense that had to struggle with these Germanic counts that instead wanted to insist with their own military ethics and just thinking about their own charisma and prestige and not giving a damn about the societas Christiana as it was considered as a peaceful community in ideal. So, however, the Christians couldn't really impose even on this base, even in the most Romanized areas, a full ideal of pacifism into which the Christians couldn't use arms, because it was evident from everyday life that not just using but also just carrying arms would be a necessity, and that nobody could even have a problem with that, because yeah, they might wonder if killing was a sin, but in practice they had at least to defend themselves. You know, maybe they thought, for now I killed, then God maybe will forgive me. I will repent, but for now it's better for me to stay alive. So what is striking is however, how in the West the same penitentials were spread, and how would they kind of settled on an average of 40 days of penitence during the early Middle Ages. And for saying that, you know, Basil had said that if you, as we've seen, if you kill someone, you're excluded by the communion for 3 years. It was a pretty long time. An archbishop like Theodore of Canterbury, that also came from an Eastern background, who was in charge from 668 to 690, so in a time into which indeed in England there would be a lot of warfare going on among all the various Anglo-Saxon lords, and that would be also a very lightly Romanized and Christianized society for Western European standards. He was less rigorous, and he basically said that if by order of your lord you have killed a man in a public war, this is very important, you have to do penitence for 40 days. What is interesting here in Theodore is that, first of all, he's talking specifically about your own lord, so it's already implying that, as Basil, by the way, that had said, you know, if there is a chief that obliges you to bring arm, which was the case also here, it's as if, you know, that counted as, okay, that has been chosen by God. Let God decide whether what your chief is right or not, but you have to follow that unheard, because, however, that chief is placed there by God's will. So, in this way, you can really make relativism on everything. I mean, if it's already decided by God, but it wasn't really so simple. And the same fact that the point is stated is that indeed the problem had been already emerged from the practice. So here it's said, and you have and this guy, if he has killed a man in a public war. So also this idea of public war is quite important, because it would be interesting to really understand what it meant in Anglo-Saxon England, a public war. Because obviously from a Germanic point of view there would be a sort of public war, which is difficult to assess even in here, but it would be, however, quite difficult to distinguish a private war if you're following a chief that has private interests in a public one. The public one could be intended perhaps as the levy of all freemen. That was really how in the Germanic societies originally the armies were raised. So this was also interesting. And there is another penitential, Anglo-Saxon penitential, roughly of the same age, that says if the king, so here there is the major political authority waging a war. If a king is leading an army into the kingdom, so within the public boundaries, the Christian boundaries, hopefully, either for ecclesiastical justice, so this is interesting. No, excuse me, I misread. In a kingdom against some rebels, and he's making war for the kingdom or for ecclesiastical justice, so it is right. Whoever commits an homicide in these circumstances will have not sinned, will have sinned, but it's not really a great, it won't really a great deal, a great fault. However, he adds, because of the bloodshed, he was killed, will not have to attend the church for 40 days. So he has to abstain into eating for some weeks, and he will have to ask the bishop to be readmitted with humility and reconciled. And once reconciled, shall he receive the communion after 40 days. Then it goes on. If there is if an invasion of pagans occupies the land, devastating churches and pushing toward the Christian people. Now this is interesting, because you have seen there was previously the case into which there was a matter of public order. Here instead there is the idea that the pagans are invading from the external. Whoever kills an enemy does not commit I'll say, how can I translate better? A serious fault. Let's translate it this way. He does not commit a serious fault, but he shall not frequent the church for 7, 14 or 40 days, and at that point, purified, he has to have access to the church. This is very interesting because first of all, it's as if, there isn't a great deal of difference, is there? I mean, in both cases, these Christians are kind of doing their duty for either the internal order or for the sake of defense of the Christian people. However, it says, if you kill someone within during the rebellions inside of the within the kingdom boundaries, you have to do penitence for 40 days. If instead you're fighting against pagan who attack you, that has to be just for theoretically even up to 40 days, depending on what you do, and you have to be purified in any case. So what I find interesting in here is that in practice there is not much of a difference from killing what it has to be a rebel, a Christian rebel, or a pagan. The pagan obviously if he's assaulting your Christian country, it's kind of less serious to having to have him killed. But the concept is always the same. You know, it's still a sin. You still have to be purified. So it's very coherent in many ways. Another interesting thing is that here the only options that are presented are essentially either a matter of public order or defensive warfare. I mean, there is no point here that says, you know, if your king is waging war to another country, maybe even a pagan one. That is quite interesting because this silence, this absence could even imply in practice that even waging war aggressively, independently from the fate of the enemy, is something wrong, and if you kill especially someone in there. So that is also interesting because there is more than else the idea of preserving the Christian community rather than expanding it by arms, and this is definitely interesting. Something that in Islam is a bit different, for instance. And the penitentials, by the way, in this sense have to be interpreted not much as a general prescription. It's not really a law. It's not really something that has to do with the law of the kingdom, because the law of the kingdom at this point in Germanic country, in the Roman-Germanic countries, would be pretty much accepting the idea of a killing. Obviously killing was wrong if it was unjustified, but there definitely would be the idea that, I don't know, if a guy entered your property and he was armed and he wanted to do something wrong, if you killed him you had to pay nothing, and or you could even take him slave and sell him as such. So here we are thinking really from a completely spiritual perspective, and the aim of these penitentials was essentially to create a medicine for the soul. I mean, it was really about the idea that killing would create a sort of sickness, a sort of impurity into the Christian's mind and body that had to be cured, and these penitentials work exactly as that. It's something that had to cure the soul for such. And we might even idealize this in the sense you say, well, but it's just, you know, it's just ideal. It's nothing that you can really tie to any I mean, it can be really conventional. Yes, in part it would be conventional, but you still have to think that killing a person, even back then when society was way more violent than our own, was still something shocking in many ways. I mean, humans are really not made for killing each other on a regular basis. Warfare can be a very traumatizing experience, even back in the day, without shells and other things that can drive you insane in a few minutes, but it's still something traumatizing. It's still something you're gonna think about. You know, emotionally speaking, killing a person, especially with those means of that time, which is not shooting a guy 500 yards away, but it's, you know, really sticking a spear into his guts and see him crying like a kid when he gets all his blood away. Well, it's something that is gonna really hit you hard. So these penitentials weren't really just thought for saying, yeah, that's a general crime, let's punish it, because there was already a law dealing with that. This is really for an inner cure. It's for an inner health. And I think this is quite important to stress, because really I think that the historiography up to now has especially emphasized the side of the prescription, you know, all the, you know, where these penitentials what these penitentials were inspired to which ancient Christian authority and so on, all philological problems. But if you even think about the actual problems that derive from killing someone for a human, and what could be the consequences in an already in a society that was already troubled by instability in many ways, I think you can find the answer. And I think 40 days for having killed someone, it's kind of a meager punishment if you think about it. It's really bad. There are many penitentials at this stage that say, this is quite interesting. Here there are some penitentials that indeed show a very ecclesiastical, a very I don't know how to say that, but a very spiritual solution. I mean, you have to be repented and that's all. But since the very first centuries of the Middle Ages, that there would be certain interferences also in the state, in the Christian state, in these matters. For instance, in the councils of Toledo in 589 and in the wine of Chalon-sur-Marne, or Chalon, I don't know where it's in French, in 650, there would be the institution of the so-called tariffed penance. I mean, the idea that if you killed someone, you could compensate that from a Christian point of view with a sort of with something else, with money. And this is quite interesting because it first of all reflects the average form of punishment that existed in the Germanic laws at that point. I mean, you kill someone, okay, you pay for that someone. If you don't have the money, you get killed yourself, and according to the damage you do, you have to pay the compensation. So this can be quite crude for our modern perspective, and it is interesting that it kind of filtered and was adapted into the Christian penitentials. And there are very crude things, like the fact that if you killed someone, you could avoid the penance if you paid with a female slave. Like, I mean, the actual sin of killing a person was quantified in a female slave. You know that female slaves at this point didn't count much. It's kind of contemptory in many ways, because it's not that you have to pay for the price of a well-fed, healthy man slave that, I mean, can make you rich with work in land, etc. By exploiting him. Here it's equated to the value of a female slave. I mean, you're saying that basically the life of the guy you killed is it's kind of nothing. A female slave would be depreciated and felt like a nothing, essentially. So there's a kind of even from these aristocracies that really made up these conventions, there is the idea that killing was something so normal that just for appeasing the local bishop you had to pay for in a certain way, but it would be something so devoid of value like a female slave. So yeah, it's kind of a disgusting perspective from today's morals, but still I think it's important to understand that it's important to understand it for understanding that world, because life really costed that little back in the day, and it would be so normal to kill the point that even if you killed so many people, and even you had to pay female slaves, that could be quite costly, telling the truth. So really watching the thing from various perspectives can help for how crude it can actually be. Here, Bed the Venerable, or at least a penitential supposedly written by Bed, said that the soldier who kills during a war has to to abstain from food for 40 days. So you find these 40 days being kind of standard measure at this point. I wanted to see here if I had something more about them. Yeah. Then here we have the Bigotian penitential that comes from 8th century Ireland. He who has killed a man in open war shall do penance for 40 days. Once again, the old Irish penitential, any man who kills a man in battle or in a brawl, or this is interesting, or by laying in wait for him, shall do penance, a year and a half of 40 nights. A year and a half of 40 nights. So here goes a bit beyond, and here it's interesting because it's introducing another point that it depends really of how you kill a person. And here the old Irish penitential is basically posing very kind of cowardly or unjust, quite futile. Cowardly ways or futile reasons to which you could kill a person. You kill a man in battle, it says, or in a brawl. Well, the man in battle, as we've seen, was pretty standard, but here it introduces in a brawl. Now, it might be that brawls and battles in early medieval Ireland looked quite similar. Who knows? No, I don't, because Irish Gaelic warfare was a hell of a thing, telling the truth. But it's still interesting that it contemplates the eventuality. I mean, a brawl can be really anything. I'd like to read the Latin term that I don't have here, because the brawl seems like can be also quarrel. There would be insults at this point. It would see as even more harming than swords. So the brawl, you don't have to think it's something like a bunch of drunken early medieval Irishmen kicking each other in a bar. Here, however, it lists other very kind of sneaky things, like lying in wait for him. So it's kind of an ambush here, isn't it? It's something not so loyal in many ways. And he shall do penance for a year and a half of 40 nights. That is a kind of long compared to the 40 days. But here you find a half of 40 nights. So there is some reminiscence of that. Here, what else we have? We have the Penitenziale Vallicellanum Primum that comes from the first half of the 8th century, seemingly, like also the Secundum that came instead at the end of the 10th. And in both we have 40 days, but in the latter we have the peculiar clarification that the abstention had to be of bread and water, because that had to they had not to eat but bread and water. So there would be quite a ways to avoid this. Like you could stuff yourself with bread and pretending you were in abstinence. So it would happen in many ways. There were, incidentally, just this summer, I was in Austria. They told me that there was the idea that even up to the last century, in an Austrian village over there, that basically during the Lent, people didn't have to eat anything that wasn't any meat, flesh, essentially, that didn't come out from the river water. So basically the local peasantry would take like deer or cows into the water and take it out and and kill it and pretend that they were eating fish, essentially. So all these kind of things that could really hide a very very mild form of penance, telling the truth. Then there is the penitential of Arundel of the end of the 10th century that comes back instead on the 3 years of penance that had been established by Saint Basil, in the case that the killer had killed the man had killed an enemy while his own country was invaded. So yeah, 3 years for a guy that is defending his homeland and kills an enemy. It's kind of theoretically of a harsh penance compared to the others. Fulbert of Chartres at the beginning of the 11th century, so here we're kind of late, kind of a feudal world in many ways, inflicts only 1 year of penance for the same crime, and at the same time Burchard of Worms in the Corrector Sive Medicus. So it's interesting here that this work was called, the corrector, so the medic. So here it comes back the idea of the healing of the kind of the ills of the soul in some way, and instead is kind of a reminiscent of Saint Augustine's criteria, because he says the confessor to ask the penitent, have you killed in war or on the order of legitimate prince who was making war to reestablish peace? Have you assassinated the tyrant that was substantially disturbing the peace and therefore projecting something evil? If yes, you will abstain for 3 Lents in the prescribed days. But if things went otherwise, so therefore you have killed. You haven't killed on behalf of a legitimate prince, at the order of a legitimate prince, you will do penance like for a voluntary homicide. It's kind of harsh, but it's kind of more. It kind of works better, doesn't it? I mean, Augustine was saying, if you have killed, fine, you will just abstain for 3 Lents in the prescribed days, but if you haven't obeyed to a legitimate rule, and you have done, and therefore something irreparably wrong, your killing has to be equated to the one of a voluntary homicide. So there was really no escape, no other way of seeing the whole thing. Then it's very interesting that, especially in when warfare came back, let's say in a very prevalent fashion during the especially in Carolingian times, where there was a lot of warfare going on, but also in the feudal age, there would be certain penitentials that would be created appositely for certain battles. After certain bloodsheds, particular bloodshed, the local community of bishops, together especially with local authorities, would decide that there had to be a sort of collective penance to be performed. For instance, here was the Battle of Soissons in 923 that was fought in the countless civil wars that were troubling the kingdom of the Western Franks at this point. Count Robert of Paris fighting with Charles the Simple. Here, supposedly tens of thousands of people joined the battle and fought in it, and there would be a terrible butchery for which tens of thousands of people in turn died. And the worst thing about this is that it was a war between Christians and Christians, Franks against Franks, and this was really the greatest nightmare of the church, that it wasn't that much important to, after all, to kill an heathen, someone who who was fighting an unjust war, was maybe aggressing you, but terrible thing to avoid from a Christian point of view would be indeed killing another Christian, so Christians killing other Christians. So as there would be a general penance required for those who for all those who have taken part in the Battle of Soissons. Do penance for 3 40-day periods. This is interesting. For 3 years. It's kind of messy, you know. Just let them do all at once. For the first 40-day period, the warriors were to be outside the church and let them be reconciled at the table of the Lord. Throughout all 3 40-day periods, they were to abstain in bread and water on appointed days. We find the same thing happening in the Battle of Hastings, famously. Here I read a bunch of things that were asked by the penance following the battle, the penitential ordinance following the Battle of Hastings. Anyone who knows that he has killed a man in the great battle is to do 1 year of penance for each man killed according to the number of men killed. This is interesting because it implies that you have to count, you have to make a body count of people you have actually killed. Which is interesting because it also means how bloody Hastings had been in practice. Then I skip to 7. It says, for those who fought in declared war, in declared war, their bishops, for the sake of mercy, impose 3 years of penance as a rule. 8. Concerning the archers, this one I like. Concerning the archers who kill ignorant of their victims because they're killing at long range, or who wound without homicide, so they hit someone but do not kill him, let them do penance for 3 lents. It's kind of long. And here it's particularly interesting because it tells you so much about that kind of society. I mean, if you kill someone face to face, it was generally in those times where there would be a few people, the enemies kind of knew each other in some way. One thing is to kill one man, looking at him in the eyes, and one thing is really shooting with your own bow and killing randomly, also because in medieval warfare you don't have to think at archers like sharpshooters. If anything, just crossbowmen usually. That archers in medieval warfare usually threw all together, like to make mass saturation fire, let's say, and they would just aim at the general thickly packed enemy formations and not to distinguish would they manage to kill. So this was felt in the Norman society. It was speedily evolving to a full feudal one, to be felt as something kind of cowardly. In fact, Norman knights would be perfectly capable of using bow and arrow, especially because they were skilled hunters. They would perfectly know how to do horse archery. But you will never see a Norman knight actually using a bow, even if you have documentary evidence of that from other historical sources. But usually the guy, Norman knight fought face to face with the enemy, and it's interesting here in the penitential there are the archer is penalized in this sense because he's killing in a cowardly fashion compared to the guy who instead went in the first line risking his life. Here I found another thing that is a bit previous to that, and then I will close, maybe with some consideration. This is another Irish penitential, the one of Command, that I hope to spell well, from the mid of the 7th century. And this is very interesting because it says, he who by a blow in a quarrel renders a man incapacitated or maimed or maimed, shall meet the injured man's medical expenses and shall make good the damages for the deformity, and shall do his work until he is healed and do penance for half a year. Now this is very interesting because it even implies that not only you have to do penitence for having incapacitated or maimed someone in a quarrel, but you have also to provide for medical expenses. So you have to compensate the guy for the loss that he had, for the damages, and this is a penitential, so it's not really a law, it's something that had to circle within the ecclesiastical milieu for the confessors to prescribe the right penance for penitence. So this is quite interesting, and there are so many penitentials that we could read about, but here the video I think it's too long already for what it is. I don't know if I rendered the idea, but I think it's very interesting. What it shows is that in Western Europe the idea of the 3 years exclusion from the communion that had been prescribed by Basil and that was theoretically present in the East basically had been commuted in something much more lighter, that from in the communities could be even exchanged for money or goods as a compensation. That tells you the influence of the Germanic juridical institutions into the matter. We have seen how probably this Germanized West and warlike West was probably less, was rather careless about human life in many ways than the East theoretically, but this can really be argued in many ways. I think there wouldn't be such an excessive difference. It was just the formal appearance that kind of accepted that these things could happen. We have seen also how, however, there would be a certain diversification into these prescriptions, meaning that there would be a debate behind it. There would be someone not just passively accepting these standard penance and then just not caring about the actual problem. There would be really people questioning whether that was the right thing to do. And we see how there are also certain stratifications in this that reflect social, other social values, like for instance in the Penitentials of for the Battle of Hastings, the archers are kind of felt like the guys that do not fight the chivalrous way, and that have to pay more because they don't even look at their enemy in the face. In our Penitentials, actually there were things like if you killed someone but you didn't want to, because that could also happen in practice. So there would be a lot of conditions to set according to the various practical eventualities that you could find, and that would be very very effective, according to me, for those people's mindset. I mean, if you find these prescriptions for such a long time, evidently, even with some variety, it still meant that they would be functional for that society. So I think this is it. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel. And I hope, as always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.